thank you everybody for taking the time to join us for not just this lecture, but for entire Shabbos. This has been a very special Shabbos. The genes of this Shabbos, of this time, is a very special opportunity where we are marking tonight, actually, the first year side of Dr. David David Natsali Rabbi Buddha Betheda Bela, who was a very fond friend, colleague, mentor to so many people in this community and beyond. In the many cases that I had the opportunity of asking Dr. Adler for advice and help, I know so many people just in the short time that I've been here, of lives is changed and saved. And the Lord is there for so many people as a mentor and as really a stellar human being. And we wish the family of Kim a long life, Ezra Hashem, so show should have continued to get that age of AC Shah's death coming. I want to thank Dr. Abramson for being at the Shabbos, and for Ilana joining us for an incredible Shabbos. In fact, I would like to take this opportunity to Dr. Abramson to give a special gift on behalf of the Underdog community to Dr. Abramson and Ilana in appreciation for this Shabbos. Appreciation for you and what you do for Clash Israel. This is something that you'll use for many good years. But understand and appreciate that we here at the Young Israel so love and so appreciate the two of you. Best friendship, a photograph. Yeah, we'll do the photograph though. Sure, yeah, I guess that was a thing. We look forward to many good years learning from and with you. Eric, please join us in welcoming Dr. Henry Abramson, our last part of the Resurgence of Israel.
That was quite a surprise. My goal for this Shabbos, for those of you who joined us for the talks over Shabbos, was to kind of shift the narrative. Since October 7th, so many of us have been engaged in trying to figure out how we are going to absorb the impact of the Tufan al-Aqsa, to use the Hamas term, the al-Aqsa, the Jerusalem flood, and how to survive this. So for the last year and a half, we've been speaking about resilience, about themes of, endurance. But now, Rabbi Trump and I, we decided it's time now for us to take a step forward and switch the theme a little bit to refer to resurgence. Because when we reflect on Jewish history, we see so many times that Jews speak louder, even with the microphone. It's so loud. I sound great, but I guess you don't hear me. Okay, so we're shifting from speaking about resilience to speaking about resurgence, to speak about how Jews in the past, when dealing with often existential threats, have not only managed to survive them, but have found new techniques, new innovative ways to change our society, our relationship to the world, in order to actually improve our chances of survival and to improve our quality of Jewish life. Just to recap very quickly, Friday night we looked at the Byzantine Empire, which had a tremendous impact on Judaism through their persecution, because as a result we developed the fixed calendar. We initiated the study that ultimately became the Talmud. We worked on new poetic forms of expression through piyut. And then early Shabbos morning at the wonderful Hashkama Minyan, we spoke about early Ashkenaz and how the threats, specifically coming from the Crusades in particular, developed a modality of social organization that fostered the growth of self-reliant institutions, including the long-lasting millennial structure that actually informs most synagogues today, with the board of directors and the rabbi and so on. And then at Musaf, we talked about the experience of the Jews in the DP camps and how there was such an incredible life-affirming impulse there among those desperate survivors from the Holocaust that I think makes a lasting impression on all of us. And then at Shalashus, we looked more locally to the Jews of New York and looked at this remarkable capacity that Jews have to reach out to other Jews, and even if they come from totally different cultures, different languages, different complexions, you name it, to recognize our common history and our common destiny, and then to afford the newcomers support and allow them to integrate into the societies that we have called our homes. And those are the lessons we learned of Resurgence that apply to the periods we looked at in the past. Tonight's lecture is a little more difficult for several reasons. One, because I'm a historian, and I'm most comfortable talking about things which are firmly in the past, which have already happened. When I went to graduate school, there was a totally different department called prophecy. It was down the hall, and that's where the political scientists and other people studied things like that. But so it's very difficult for me to actually hazard opinions on. I certainly don't want to hazard opinions on what we should do. I think that the colossally challenging decisions that the Israeli government, the Israeli military have to deal with are well beyond my capacity. I do not have the temerity to suggest that I know what they should be doing. But I do believe that we can reflect on what we have learned so far and how we might improve ourselves, both in Israel and in the diaspora. So that's my goal for today, to think about how we can enter into a new period of resurgence in this strange time that we're living in. I would like to begin with a joke. I apologize for those of you who've heard this joke before, but it is a good one, and I think it speaks a little bit to our challenges. The joke goes like this. I actually heard it when I was studying in the Soviet Union, where I actually learned a lot of the best jokes ever. The Soviets were great at these jokes. The joke was like this. There's a cucumber store. And, it was a period of great privation in the late 1980s, and Gorbachev was trying to restart the economy, the perestroika and things like that. Very, very difficult. So there's a whole cherha, a whole lineup of all the various nationalities represented in the Soviet Union outside this cucumber store waiting for it to open. The manager opens up the window, leans out, and he says, "Everyone in the line, we've just learned that there were going to be a smaller shipment of cucumbers today than expected. All Jews, please leave the line and go home." So what can they do? They just, shrug, and that's the Jewish condition, and they get home and they leave. People are waiting. An hour later, he opens up the door and he says, "We've just learned that one of the cucumber delivery trucks broke down on the way. Less cucumbers than expected are arriving. All Uzbeks, Tatars, and Kazakhs, any Central Asians, please leave the line and go home." Right? Lower status in the Soviet hierarchy, they all have to go home. Finally, this goes on and on until there's only pure titular nationality Soviet citizens in the line, no defects whatsoever in their yichus or their nationality. He opens up the window and says, "We just learned the last cucumber truck has been hijacked by the mafia. No cucumbers are arriving. Everyone please go home." So Petro turns to Ivan and says, "You see, the Jews get all the breaks." Thank you for laughing. That was very cool. Now, sometimes we feel like that, especially, I think, with the craziness that has been happening over the past year and a half. Sometimes we feel like, does the rest of the world not see what's going on? Or there's such a huge, disjoint between what we are perceiving and what the rest of the world sees when they look at this situation. So what I'd like to do is to take us through, as best I can, a lightning review of at least two periods of the history of the Jews in Israel before statehood, and then I'm going to focus on statehood. It will be, for many of you, a redundant review because I know that many of you are deeply involved in this history, and I apologize for that. But I also feel that it is relevant for us to fill in gaps whenever those are possible. And there are also younger people who may not be as immersed in this dramatic history as many other people in the room are. So apologies in advance. Let's get started. This is a remarkable historical artifact. It is one of about 24 coins that were minted by the Roman Empire after the end of the Great Revolt that took place from 66 to 74. This revolt, of course, was a dramatic turning point in Jewish history because the Romans had destroyed the temple, had taken perhaps 100,000 Jews out of the land of Israel and sent them off into Roman servitude. The Jews would engage in restive rebellion a few more times, the Kitos Rebellion, and then later the disastrous Bar Kokhba Rebellion. But in the context of the post-war era, the Romans wanted to win a lot of propaganda battles. And one of the best ways to get a message out then, and to some degree less now, was through currency. Because everyone had to handle currency. It was a valuable thing. And it was a way for the government to get out a message, because you had to look at the coin, what did it say? And this is one of about 24 examples. On the left, you see Vespasian, the emperor. Some of them also portray his son Titus. And on the right, you have a symbol that reflects on the victory over Judea. It says, Judea capta, Judea is taken captive, Judea is under our control. And it shows a Roman soldier standing next to a balsam palm tree, one of the most important exports of Israel at the time. And on the right is a despondent Jewish woman, as if she's saying tachanun, penitential prayers here. She's in an attitude of decline. She's clearly saddened, and it reflects on the utter crushing of the Jewish revolt, and by extension, the statehood of Jews was at a permanent end. Sometimes the woman is portrayed even as a captive with hands tied behind her back, meaning to say that the Jews are completely at our disposal. And for a long time, this is really what exemplified the Jewish state after the Roman attack on the land of Israel. But nevertheless, over the period of diaspora, the next 2,000 years, Israel remained remarkably central to our thoughts and our emotions. Of course, it is central in geography. You can see how it is right at the middle of the continents of Africa, Asia, and Europe. And as a result, as a crossroads, it had tremendous import economically and particularly in the exchange of ideas. But spiritually, it was hugely important to us. This is a remarkable map by the Protestant theologian Heinrich Günting. He was actually a very poor theologian. He had difficulty holding down a job. He was a rather free thinker, but he was an amazing map maker. And he used to make these beautiful maps that portrayed, like, for example, Europe is portrayed as a grand lady with flowing robes and things like that. And here he portrays the world as a clover leaf. And at the center, in the middle, is in fact Jerusalem. At the center of this clover leaf, which is a way of graphically representing how he felt about Israel as a Protestant theologian living in Europe in the 16th century, but it's the way Jews have always felt about Israel. Although if you look really close at this image, and it was actually incorporated into a beautiful bencher that I used this afternoon. It actually has 3 crosses here in Jerusalem, indicating it's very Christian, so maybe not so appropriate for the bencher, but still we appreciate the sensitivity there. We, of course, have long roots there, and this, is patently obvious to all of us, but I'd like to review it very quickly. We come into the land, of course, from Mesopotamia. The roots of Abraham described in the book of Genesis, which we read just a few months ago, has him traveling all the way along the Euphrates River and then down into Egypt eventually. Then, of course, we have the Exodus, which we were just talking about last week and this week, and then next week we'll continue with the discussion. Jews wander for 40 years in the desert, finding the only country in the Middle East without any natural resources of oil. That was a joke, but here is the way, but this is kind of like the family history. If we look at the archaeological record and we look at how others saw us, there's a great paucity of information, meaning we have a tremendously detailed history that's described in the Tanakh, but that's essentially our history. That's our internal family story. If we look at the archaeological record and see what did other cultures say about us, it's quite fascinating. First, we have the earliest mentions of topography of Israel, meaning just the actual places that we associate with Israel today. We have the so-called execration figurines from Egypt. And these are basically sort of like ancient Egyptian voodoo dolls, where they would write down the names of all the places where people they hated lived, and then they would ritually destroy them, break them up, burn them, as various other aspects of disrepute. And that's kind of like what they said about places. The first actual reference to the people of Israel is in this remarkable stele. Here you can see it to scale. It's quite a large obelisk. Here is a full view of it. The so-called Merneptah stele that was erected by Pharaoh Merneptah, who was the 13th son of Pharaoh Ramses II, who many scholars feel is actually the Pharaoh described in the Exodus that we read about today, for example. And so his 13th son went on a smash and grab expedition throughout the land of Israel. And when he came back, he commemorated it in this stele, which dates from about the year 1210 before the Common Era. And right at the bottom is this reference here: Israel is wasted, its seed is no more. So to paraphrase Mark Twain, this obituary of the Jewish people is somewhat premature, but this is essentially the first thing the outside world has to say about Jews. We have finally gotten rid of those noxious people. Merneptah, by contrast, actually looks terrible. We found his mummy. He looks awful, but the Jews are still around. We, of course, then enter into the land of Israel in the 13th century after Egyptian bondage. We don't have a tremendous amount of archaeological evidence. There are some fascinating refuse pits that are consistent with the demonstration of a large increase in the population in the Judean foothills in particular in the 13th century. And those refuse pits are quite fascinating because they indicate a very, very low incidence of pork consumption, meaning that the people who came in there were actually keeping some form of kosher, which is quite distinct from other sites in Israel. But we also have these unusual structures, which some archaeologists have said are uniquely Jewish. They're called the four-roomed houses. It's not at all clear that they are specifically Jewish. We have not found any statuettes of dancing Hasidim in them or anything like that. But we have found some unusual artifacts that may suggest that in fact I know. Sorry about that. But the rest of the lecture is all downhill, so we have to get this one visual joke in it. Now, I want to pause before we get to the more important history. We're going to jump ahead about 2,000 years in a moment. But I want to just reflect on this history here, because if you go back to the very origins of Jewish history, you'll find that we have a tremendous amount of data that's kind of inside family history, but the archaeological record is very weak until you get about to King Omri, which is, you'll recall, from Menachem Bey. That's where he starts to pick up, but he's not one of the most famous kings in our tradition. That's when we begin to see a lot more archaeological data that corresponds to what we know in Tanakh, but very, very few incidents of things prior to that. There is, of course, the famous Tel Dan stele that was here in New York a little while ago with reference to Beit David, the house of David. Even though David strides large over Tanakh, he has very, very little impact on the archaeological record that we have discovered so far. But I want to reflect on that for one moment, and I want to tell you a personal story. So my grandparents, who are portrayed on the right there, Alex and Polly from Lithuania, moved up to northern Canada in 1905 is when my grandfather came. 1913 is when my grandmother came. My grandfather did not want to fight the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War. The Canadian government was having land grants for Baltic farmers, and my Zaidi said, "I'm a farmer." And he was terrible at it. So within about 5 years, he ended up becoming, like many Jews this time, a dry goods salesman. He had my father, Oliver Shalom, would say, he had a shmata dealership. He had a clothing store. And there was a huge fire in the region in 1916. And my father, Oliver Shalom, told me that what happened was there was no way to control that fire. As we see even a century later, what's happening out west. So my grandfather, who had a stock of dry goods, he dug up his backyard, covered all the work boots and the pants and the shirts and all that with burlap. He buried it in the backyard, covered it up just in time for he and his wife, and aunt, who was expecting at the time, and their youngest son to go run into the Abitibi River and to wait in the river till the fire passed. And actually hundreds of people in the region were killed. But when people came out and the town was completely destroyed by the fire, my Zayda was able to go back and dig up the dry goods and to give them to impoverished people who had absolutely nothing, their homes burned down, selling it essentially on credit. And when they finally were able to rebuild their lives, they were able to go back to my grandfather, and the business thrived. And in fact, it lasted for over a century in this small town in northern Ontario. So why am I telling you this story? Primarily because we don't have much data about that 1916 fire. We know it happened. There's no question about that. We have lots of news reports. We know a lot of people who were killed in the 1916 fire, but we don't know anything about the story of Alex Abramson and what was happening with his family. And if I were just going on the historical record, I would have to say I assume it did not happen. But on the other hand, it is an extremely valuable story, and it tells me so much more than what actually happened there. It tells me about my grandfather's innovation, my grandmother's courage, about their foresight, about their charity, and about how they became builders of this small community in the north. And so I deeply cherish this story as part of my family Masorah. And that is, to a large degree, how we have to look at a lot of the early material in Tanakh and so on. Those are our internal stories. We receive them as a Masorah that I regard as deeply meaningful, just as I regard the story that my father told me about my grandfather, but it does not necessarily have a deep mark on the historical record in the archaeological sense. As more research is done, I'm sure we will find more and more evidence to validate a lot of the material in the Tanakh, but that's basically telling us the early story. Okay, let us now move on to the more difficult material, and we should look at the history of the establishment of Israel, and then we'll come to some of the resurgent letters, and I'm hoping you'll be able to match it there. Here is a fascinating exchange between Yusuf al-Din Pasha al-Khalidi, who was a Palestinian leader before the term was really used to apply to the people. He's actually the ancestor of Rashid Khalidi, who is at Columbia University today, who is a noted historian and with obviously a political viewpoint that in many ways I disagree with, but I highly respect his scholarship. He wrote a letter to Theodore Herzl in 1899, beautiful French letter. And it says, very politely, he refers to him as, excellency and so on. He says, the idea of Zionism is totally natural, beautiful, and just. Who can contest the rights of the Jews to Palestine? My God, historically, it is certainly your country. And what a wonderful sight it would be if the Jews are able to reconstitute themselves as a nation, independent, respected, and happy, able to render impoverished humanity its services in the region as in the past. He is then going to go on to a huge but, saying it will be hugely disruptive, there's so many Arabs living in the region and so on. He tries to dissuade Herzl from his progress. Herzl responds. Herzl writes back, "You see another difficulty, Excellency." This is a very polite form of diplomatic correspondence. "Regarding the existence of non-Jewish population in Palestine. But who would think to remove them? It is their own well-being, their own individual wealth that we will improve by bringing our homes. Do you think that an Arab who owns land or a house in Palestine with a value of 3,000-4,000 francs will be very angry to see the price of his land increased in short time, to see it increased 5 or 10 times in value, perhaps in a few months? That will certainly happen with the arrival of the Jews. This is what the indigenous population needs to realize, that they will gain excellent brothers, just as the Sultan will gain faithful and good subjects who will bring prosperity to this province which is their historical homeland." So Herzl also recognizes the rights of the local population to the land, and he certainly does not want to displace them. But it's fascinating to think that this argument between Khalidi and Herzl, which is conducted far more politely than most were, nevertheless represents how Jews and Arabs have talked about it for most of the last century. That the Arabs are arguing this is hugely disruptive, it is unjust, And the Jews are saying, don't worry, your financial situation will improve. Your prosperity will improve. Herzl assumes that prosperity is what they want, that a quality of life, that stability, and a place to raise their children, and health care, and a future, that's what will solve the problem. And unfortunately, it's proved to be wrong again and again and again, because the value systems are fundamentally different, as we shall see. So what was happening at the end of the 19th century? Here's something in the middle of the century that gives you a reality check. We should know that there are problems with the survey. The Ottoman Empire was not known for its scientific accuracy, but based on the best data that we have, Jews constituted about 4% of the population of the land of Israel at the time. Muslims constituted well over 80%, and Christians are coming in at about 8%. So the Jews only had a tiny foothold demographically in the land of Israel. And ironically, as Herzl predicted, the greater arrival of Jews through organizations like BILU, which is one of the first major Jewish Zionist groups from the 1880s, beginning to farm the land and especially bringing in European investment, dramatically increased the number of Arabs coming to the land as immigrants at the turn of the 20th century, and capitalizing on the economies of scale that were being developed as the Jews were investing heavily in their land. It's ironic to look at some of the propaganda posters used by Jewish organizations that uses the term Palestine. Now it seems ironic, but here you can see help and build Palestine, and it's meant to be a Jewish worker. You see at the bottom, helped in Boyen Eretz Yisrael, right? Because clearly at that time we regarded the word Palestine as synonymous with Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. We didn't recognize a political distinction. I especially like this one, which really, expresses the muscular quality of early Zionism, with a nation reborn on its ancestral soil. I mean, what a message. It just captures the imagination. You can see even how Al-Khalidi was impressed by it. And this is why so many of us had those little tiny blue boxes. We're putting in a par kopecks, a few pennies every week when we're lighting candles to support the Jews in this remarkable venture. As you know, of course, and I'm not going to take too much time with this very basic review, but we should at least hit some of the most important points. In 1917, in the context of the closing years of World War I, as the Ottoman Empire was beginning to collapse, the British government, along with other European powers who were engaged in, the big game of imperial politics, decided that they would in fact invest in this Zionist enterprise. There's a long-standing British philo-Semitism that fed into it. And in this document, which is excoriated heavily by the pro-Palestinian movement today, Lord Balfour issued a statement on behalf of the British government that reads, "His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object." At that point, Jews didn't even bother reading the rest of the paragraph because they were already breaking out the Kiddush, because this was like the huge celebration. After 2,000 years, this powerful British Empire, the largest empire in the world, was going to support this venture. The second paragraph was written primarily for the Arab audience, the second section, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in other countries. The second half of this paragraph was a total disaster, and it was really an example of the British really trying to promise two things at once, trying to dance at two weddings, which is ultimately impossible. This is a depiction from here in the States. This came out of San Francisco, I believe, a comparison of Yehuda Maccabee, achieving sovereignty in 165 before the Common Era, to General Allenby entering into Jerusalem in November 1917. It was also around the time of Hanukkah that year, to say that we are seeing history repeat itself. Just like Yehuda Maccabee achieved sovereignty for the Jews, so too would Allenby what a comparison, then give sovereignty to the Jews as well. Of course, it didn't work out so simple. It only took another couple of years before you had the first riots against Jews. It occurred in the context, ironically, of the Nabi Musa festival. Nabi Musa means the prophet Moses festival. It's a Muslim celebration of Moshe. And in the context of that first uprising, some 5 Jews and 4 Arabs were killed and 230 people were injured. And this sparked what we sometimes call the cycle of violence. I'm not sure it's a very fair term because it misses some of the qualitative aspects of the horrific nature of the violence that has occurred in the region. But what we can say for certain is that there were attacks by Arabs on Jews. There were also the occasional attacks by Jews on Arabs as well. If we go down the route of measuring them tit for tat, I don't think we will have a productive use of our time, but that is fundamentally where a lot of the historical discussion is bogged down, trying to assign relative levels of blame. I'm just going to shelve that for our discussion tonight because I have a lot of the material I want to discuss. So the British eventually say, okay, obviously the Balfour Declaration is not solving the problem, and in fact they have created additional problems, so they sent Earl Peel to come up with a plan, and he comes up with this plan, which was actually probably the best plan that could have been figured out under the circumstances. The bottom line is that Peel recommended that this section be given to Jewish settlement for a state. That's bounded by this reddish line here. Obviously, it's a fraction of what the state of Israel is today, but that's more or less where you had Jews actually settling. At this time, by the way, I gave you that 4% figure, that was 1850. We're now about 75 years later, tremendous amount of Jewish immigration to the region, but there's still, just beginning to get into the double digits. We do not have anywhere near majority of the population. And he writes, I'll just read these bold paragraphs. The application to Palestine of the mandate system in general, the mandate system refers to the notion that the British were given temporary control over it by the League of Nations, which was the precursor to the United Nations, and of the specific mandate in particular, implies the belief that the obligations thus undertaken towards the Arabs and the Jews respectively would prove in course of time to be mutually compatible, owing to the conciliatory effect on the Palestinian Arabs of the material prosperity which Jewish immigration would bring in Palestine as a whole. This was Herzl's argument, that if we bring in more money, standard of living rises, Arabs will be happy, and we will have no more conflict. That belief has not been justified, and there seems to be no hope of its being justified in the future. This was written in 1935, and much of it can be applied without doubt to our situation today. Nothing has changed. An irrepressible conflict has arisen between two national communities within the narrow bounds of one small country. There is no common ground between them. Their national aspirations are incompatible. The Arabs desire to revive the traditions of the Arab Golden Age. The Jews desire to show what they can achieve when restored to the land in which the Jewish nation was born. Neither of the two national ideals permit of combination in the service of a single state. This is essentially the birth of the two-state solution. Originally, the mandate was hoping that they could give all of it to the Jewish state. There's a little side chapter with what they would do with Jordan that ended up becoming a de facto a Palestinian state. But Israel was supposed to be all Jewish, and they were supposed to work it out. And the Arabs living there hopefully would be happy as the financial conditions improved. Peel was the first to really put in writing, without doubt, this is not going to work. We need a two-state solution. The two states he proposes are that red area for the Jews, the rest of the land of Israel for the Arabs, and this strange sort of appendix thing emerging from just south of Tel Aviv through Jerusalem was to be an international zone that included the holy city of Jerusalem, that it was supposed to be neither for Arabs nor for Jews. The Peel report was not accepted, And we see that the Arabs, for their part, decided to ally themselves more with the Axis as we get into World War II. You can see here Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, meeting with Hitler. This is actually one of the more powerful elements of Khalidi's research at Columbia that indicates that the Palestinians simply repeatedly, Palestinian leadership in particular, repeatedly making bad decisions that simply did not promote the idea of dialogue. There's no question that there's culpability on the Israeli side as well for bad decisions. There's no monopoly on that, but this is an ongoing phenomenon we see throughout the 20th century. Of course, the crucial moment that is where people tend to focus their attention right now is what's called the Nakba, the catastrophe in Arabic, which refers to the displacement of some 750,000 Palestinians. They are still not using that term to describe themselves, but nevertheless, a displacement of a huge number of people and the creation of a refugee condition, which has been promoted by many of the neighboring states for the last 70-odd years. But it's important to note that there's also a Jewish Nakba as well, because immediately after the establishment of the State of Israel, there would be, ironically, just about the same number of Jews evicted or coerced out of living in surrounding Arab countries. So let's have a quick look at that. The British, floundering about trying to figure out how they're going to solve this implacable situation, they send Colonel Secretary Malcolm MacDonald. He comes up with his white paper, which, brilliant, in 1939, on the eve of the Holocaust, he suggests limiting Jewish immigration to Israel, which is, of course, at the most desperate time for Jews on the eve of the Nazi onslaught. And after the war, there's, of course, a tremendous pressure now with only a tiny remnant of Jews in places like the DB camps, as we discussed yesterday, increasing international pressure on the British to allow Jews to enter. The British eventually throw up their hands in frustration. They say, we can't handle this anymore. They do the same thing, by the way, in India. They simply back out of India, and that ensues a great war between India and the emerging country of Pakistan. They send it to the League of Nations, which is now renamed the United Nations, which comes up with this really bizarre plan. Again, there's a lot of fascinating discussion of how they came up with the plan, but let's look at it quickly. They basically said, let's partition the land a little differently than Peel suggested. Let's break it into 7 sections. We'll give, I think I have a little pointer here. Yeah, we'll give these 3 green sections to the Jews in the Zionist movement. We'll give these sort of orangish sections. We'll give these orangish sections. I think when I turn on the laser pointer, it turns on. Let's try that again. Let's see if I do this. Does it turn on? Oh, okay. We'll give these orange sections to the Arabs. And once again, Jerusalem becomes an international zone. And you know the story, of course. The Arab nations refuse to accept this plan. Israel, even though it is a strange and largely unworkable plan, these are bizarre boundaries, they accept it, they declare statehood, and the Arabs declare war. The horrific War of Independence is fought over the next year between 1948 and 49. Israel is invaded by 5 armies. And although it's often been portrayed as a David versus Goliath, and it is a truly remarkable thing that the Jews were able to, not only hold their own, not be driven into the sea, they actually expand their borders ever so slightly. But most military historians today have characterized it more as a David versus many Davids, because the Arab forces were plagued with incompetence, poor coordination, poor communications, and so on. And the Jews, on the other hand, their backs were to the sea. They had tremendous motivation, phenomenal morale, and even without the kind of arms that they were clearly outnumbered, they nevertheless were able to fight with greater determination and ultimately win. And so these are the boundaries of Israel in the year 1949. These are the armistice boundaries because they had no peace treaties. This region here, which is called the West Bank because it's west of the Jordan River. I just saw on a telegram today that apparently President Trump has issued a new ruling that in American documentation, they're no longer to use the term West Bank, which is somewhat of a neutral term, but Judea and Samaria are the Hebrew traditional terms and geographically correct. And so that's apparently going to be American official geography now, Judea and Samaria. And also the Gulf of America. Be careful when you go down to Texas. Don't ask where's the Gulf of Mexico. But, to a certain degree, these nomenclature is important. It does imply certain historical realities, but please forgive me if I use terms that offend your political sensibilities. So this is where we are in 1949. The Nakba, so-called, is the displacement of this 750,000 Palestinians. Again, they won't be using that term until the 1960s, but they're definitely displaced to refugee camps set up in Gaza, in the regions of Judea, Samaria, in Jordan, in Lebanon, and so on. The reason for the displacement is also a heated topic among historians. That you will have kind of like a heroic version that is sort of the Israeli standard line up until the 1990s that indicates that this was entirely a voluntary movement that was presaged on the notion that the Arab armies would then liberate huge swaths of territory that these refugees could then return to. This is probably what most of you learned if you went to day schools, because it was like the standard kind of Israeli model. The Palestinian model emphasizes the violence, sometimes quite awful, perpetrated on Palestinian villages that drove many Palestinians out of fear of the brutality of Israeli soldiers. Since the 1990s, there has been kind of like a coming together of historians and what they call the New Historian School in Israel, some of which is a little bit further to the left, some which further to the right. But I would hazard that it makes sense that the truth is somewhere between those two extremes, which both serve political purposes. And I have to say that if I were a Palestinian parent with young children and I'm in a war zone, I would probably want to leave myself. The degree to which I felt this was a voluntary choice as opposed to being forced out, it's irrelevant. You want to keep your children safe, I would think. But I've been criticized for that, but I think common sense view is not for us today, though. And on the other hand, the so-called Jewish Nakba is represented by many Muslim states in the region simply expelling their Jews, confiscating their property, threatening them, coercing them, creating a massive exodus of about 820,000 Jews from the entire region, emptying many countries where Jews had lived for centuries, sometimes thousands of years. The community of Iraq, for example, which is ancient, it goes all the way back to the Talmud, is basically emptied out of its Jews as a result. So it's huge population changes. So at this point, I want to look at one more war because it's crucial for our understanding of our current circumstances, and then hopefully we'll be able to get to the so-called lessons of history, which I put in quotation marks because I feel leery about drawing lessons other than what things actually happened. These are, by the way, a few quotes I share with my undergraduates quite frequently. You're all familiar with Santayana's quote, "Those who cannot remember their past are condemned to repeat it." That's what I usually tell them about the final exam. If you don't remember, you'll have to take this course again. William Faulkner writes, "The past is never dead. It isn't even past. We are still living in the past. We just don't recognize it." And Mark Twain writes, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes." So the arguments of, I just read the Peel report myself about 6 months ago, and I could not believe how accurate it was as a descriptor of our conditions, but it was written in the 1930s, but basically letting us know what's going to happen if we don't pay attention to his conclusions. Not that his suggestions would work now. The Six-Day War, of course, I'm sure you're all familiar with it, a massive and remarkable victory by the Israeli anticipating a huge attack from Egypt and Syria, and within 6 short days, they not only are able to stave off the attack, but actually increase their territory dramatically. And what they decided to do was they annexed, meaning made permanently part of Israel, the West Bank, the Golan Heights because of its strategic value, and also the East Jerusalem, which included all of Jerusalem, united Jerusalem, including the Old City for its obvious historic and spiritual value. But the West Bank, with its large Arab population, was not annexed because usually when you annex a territory, you give the people living there citizenship. And that would create a demographic imbalance in Israel that would, upset the fact that Israel is a Jewish state. And this is a very fundamental idea. I apologize for saying something so obvious to many of you in the audience, but thank you for staying. Israel attempts to do two things, and they may not be completely compatible with each other. So far, we have been successful, but it is hugely difficult. On the one hand, Israel must be a Jewish state. That's the whole point of its existence. It is designed, as Herzl had conceived it, as a place of refuge for Jews. If they are persecuted elsewhere, it must be a state that values Jewish citizenship. At the same time, influenced very heavily by the Enlightenment and by this country, it wants to be a democratic state. It wants to be a state where one person, one vote, and we decide, not as a theocracy, although definitely influenced by the tradition of Jewish law and so on, it nevertheless is a democratic state. But the challenge is, if the demography of Israel becomes majority non-Jewish, it could easily lose its Jewish character, including the very central aspect of its refuge status. And then on the other hand, if we don't allow people to have their democratic say, then of course it undermines the democratic values of the state. And that's why Israel has been able to manage itself with roughly a 20% Arab minority fairly successfully. But the idea of increasing that to a 50% minority or 49% minority is unthinkable. They simply can't do it without destroying the Jewish character of the state. So hence, these regions were simply occupied, and it was a military term. They were held in abeyance, including the Gaza Strip, highly populated. And they anticipated that they would eventually be able to make peace. It took a very long time and one more war, before finally Anwar Sadat, shown on the left, calls up Jimmy Carter, or actually called up Menachem Begin on the right, representing Israel, and suggesting peace. And this is, of course, brokered by President Jimmy Carter, a great, sort of martyr in the American role in peacekeeping in Israel. And they all look very happy. And in fact, the peace with Egypt has basically been stable, not a particularly warm relationship, but nevertheless, they have not had open hostilities, some minor skirmishes around Eilat that are often papered over. But Egypt refused to take back Gaza. Egypt said, we'll take back the entire Sinai Peninsula in exchange for peace, but Gaza, Menachem, is your headache. It's filled with a very radical Muslim population, and in fact, one of the organizations that was a parent of Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, would later assassinate Anwar Sadat in public. His own bodyguard turned on him and shot him in public. And so Anwar Sadat, who was a courageous leader who first fought against Israel in the 1973 war, was able to reach out and make peace with Israel, but he paid for it with his life. The second stage, of course, would be the Oslo Accords, in which Israel attempted to make peace with Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization. At this point, we can genuinely speak of a Palestinian people, because these are the Arabs in the region who up until now had been relying heavily on Arab neighbors to rescue them. There was a pan-Arab movement. They were relying on Syria, relying on Egypt. But the humiliating defeat of 1967 led the Palestinians to realize they can't rely on other countries. And then when Sadat betrayed them by normalizing relations with Israel, that was unconscionable. So internally, the Palestinians decided to develop on their own a political movement, which was headed by this man. And their initial strategy was simply international terrorism. Taking over airplanes, hijacking. They pioneered the whole institution of airline hijacking. the horrendous massacre of Olympic athletes at Munich. They were immune to the concept of international norms, the idea that sports are intended to be completely politics-free and so on. And even horrific massacres like the attack on a primary school in Ma'alot, Israel, in which dozens of primary school children were killed. Horrific massacres that characterized the PLO appropriately as a terrorist organization. But they simply could not succeed. Israel learned to adapt. Israel learned to protect itself. We all remember what flying was like before 9/11. Israel had learned a lot of those lessons well before that. Flying El Al was always a huge security adventure. But the Palestinians then developed a new strategy called the Intifada. The first Intifada began in 1987, and this began the process of an aspect of the conflict which I think Israel has been losing since 1987, and that is fundamentally the propaganda war. That Israel's original posture in the rest of the world, their perception in the rest of the world as the David against the Goliath, was eroded heavily by images like this one, showing a Palestinian boy throwing rocks against a muscular Israeli tank. And these kinds of images with low-level violence left Israel largely defenseless on the world stage, and they began to gain tremendous support worldwide, which has only increased exponentially since then. Israel, by way of compensating, began to impose more and more restrictions on the Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza, who were heavily dependent on the Israeli economy and were coming into the state of Israel at the rate of about 30,000 a day to engage in construction work and so on. So many more humiliating checkpoints and things like that were instituted. I remember well before October 7th, in many university campuses, you would have Palestinian protests that consisted of checkpoints, where if students wanted to go to the library, they had to go through a checkpoint, and it was meant to try and give an impression of what it was like at that time. This is exacerbated as well by the increasing number of settlements in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria as well. And ultimately, what ends up happening is Yasser Arafat makes peace with Yitzhak Rabin, shown on the left, the Prime Minister of Israel, a former hawk, with, of course, Bill Clinton, once again, an American president, presiding over this. And the main reason why Yitzhak Rabin decided to make peace with Arafat was largely because Arafat was losing his funding as the Soviet Union collapsed, because it was a proxy war between America and the Soviet Union. And Yitzhak Rabin famously noted that he has the opportunity to make peace with one enemy, or if Arafat loses his stature, he'll have to make peace with 1,000 enemies. And he's thinking in particular of Hamas, which was beginning to rise as a very different movement than Arafat's Fatah, which is ironically more moderate than Hamas. So Rabin decides to ultimately reach out, and they conducted the Oslo Accords, which basically divided the land of Israel into a Palestinian region and an Israeli region. For this, as of course we're all familiar, Rabin also lost his life, assassinated this time by an Israeli extremist. It's an ironic and sad parallel to the way Anwar Sadat lost his life. The land of Israel, according to the Oslo Accords, is then divided up into regions where the Palestinians have some control. They don't have statehood yet, but the notion was that there would be confidence-building measures, that as the Israelis felt that their security was enhanced and was stable, then they would give more authority to the Palestinians, and ultimately that would grow into two states living side by side between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. It turned out to be a rather fanciful dream. The alternative is a one-state solution, which presents its own challenges, neither of which seems to be workable. Palestinians tend to complain about this map, which indicates, their shrinking proportion of the land of Israel, but Israelis tend to complain about this map, which says, look at the size of Israel in the context of all these other Muslim states. You can't even fit the name of the country into the country on the map. It's too small. And we see this debate going on right now with President Trump suggesting that Egypt and Jordan should take in refugees from Gaza. And Egypt and Jordan, by response, and many other Arab states saying, no, we're not going to perpetrate another Nakba. We're not going to displace Gazans from their homes. In my humble opinion, I think if we had a poll of actual Gazans asking them where they would like to live, I have no doubt in my mind that a significant proportion that would say, yes, we would like very much to be, living in a country without war. But that's stepping out of my historian shoes for you. Okay. The second Intifada is really far more horrific than the first. And unlike the first Intifada, which was led by Fatah, this one is led by Hamas. This period of time, I'm sure many of you remember it, it was horrific. Bus bombings, attacks on public restaurants, lynchings of Jews who happened to wander into the wrong neighborhood, absolutely horrific demonstrations of violence. To compensate, Israel erected a massive security barrier or wall to try and physically separate themselves from the West Bank. Palestinians argue that this was a de facto border. It remains to be seen whether that is the case, or the de facto border may end up being the Jordan River in the end. And Israelis relied heavily at this point on their superior technology. This was one of the early conclusions that are coming out of the assessment of what happened on October 7th, is that we got lazy because we thought we were too smart. That we had this amazing technology of the Iron Dome, that basically all of the threats in Gaza and West Bank could easily be managed by our superior technology. And that turned out to be a disaster, because with fairly low-tech devices, they were able to circumvent these amazing things and break through with horrific consequences. This is what Gaza looked like before 2005. The blue areas represent regions of Jewish settlement, because you'll recall Egypt did not want to take Gaza back in their peace treaty with Israel, so Israel began to have settlements inside Gaza. But they were very, very difficult to defend, and very expensive to maintain, because it required a huge military presence in this very unhappy population of Palestinians. And so in 2005, a very, very controversial, gut-wrenching decision that basically split Israel in two, Ariel Sharon, the prime minister, decided to disengage from Gaza, as if to say, basically, the territory is yours, have at it. The reason for it is that he feared that if any other solution were reached where they were to take over Gaza, the demographic imbalance would be affected in Israel. They could not possibly contain a large number, about 1.5 million Palestinians at the time. And so therefore he felt it's best for us to simply leave, and hopefully with the opportunity to create their own state, the Gazans will do well and we will have peace with them ultimately. This was hugely controversial. Israeli society was very, very narrowly divided, 50-50, on whether or not this was a good idea. The images of Jewish communities being dismantled and people literally being dragged out of their homes, their kibbutzim in Gush Katif, places like this, was very hard. But Israel went along with it to see what would happen of the idea. They had elections shortly thereafter in the Palestinian Autonomy and in Gaza. These are the results. You can see that Fatah, the Green, the old Palestinian Autonomy Party, which is closely related to the Oslo Accords and so on, they basically won in the West Bank. They narrowly lost in Gaza. And so Gaza became a Hamas territory. Hamas, unlike Fatah, was declared a terrorist organization appropriately by the American government. And then in the next year, there was an internal coup, and Fatah was completely driven out of Gaza, and they have not had elections since then. Palestinians are deeply pessimistic about the PA as a whole. They've had the same president since 2006. He is 88 years old, And one of the frustrations is, well, I'm not going to get to that right now. So this is basically where we are. And this is, I think, one of the most difficult lessons that it took me a long time to assimilate, and I have to say I'm not sure I get it even now. After this horrific attack on October 7th, we see so much material coming out in places like Memory, which is an amazing resource. It stands for Middle East Media Research Institute. It's an institution that basically surveys the Arab media, and whenever there's anything that talks about Israel, they will translate it and put those clips up on YouTube so you can read the subtitles of all what Arabs are saying to each other, both pro-Palestinian, even anti-Palestinian. And unfortunately, there's a lot of memory material that they don't have to put subtitles in anymore because we have all kinds of material coming out of, for example, Dearborn, Michigan, with English language imams saying things that I can't believe are legal to say if you're a 501c3 organization in this country. But the kind of statements that are coming out from them are just so mind-boggling. Therefore, nobody should blame us for the things they do, justifying attacks on civilians that I simply cannot comprehend. And, we've all seen these kinds of things where for years Hamas has had an educational institution embedded within UNRWA institutions, which, by the way, we learned from one of the hostages recently released, was actually housing one of the captives for a period of her time in captivity, where they actually put on these primary school plays enacting things like the attacks on outposts and kidnapping of Israeli soldiers. I mean, we've all been to plays with our children, our grandchildren, first grade, second grade, Chumash plays, things like that. The very idea that you would go to a play and you would watch 6, 7-year-old kids dressed up in full military gear, taking people captive, sometimes shooting them on stage, it's mind-boggling. It's like a different value system altogether. I think most powerfully, I got the idea when I listened to this woman whose child was killed in some of the bombings. She writes, by Allah, she says, by Allah, if all my children and grandchildren are martyred for the sake of Allah, it will make me happy. Now, I'm a grandfather, and I'm proud of what my children do for the state of Israel. I could imagine being proud, God forbid, of a tragedy happening if it was done for the sake of the state of Israel. But I could never say it would make me happy. How can a Bubby actually say it will make me happy, my children? And we see many, many examples of this. This is not unique. There are many, many examples where I have to say Hamas is a death cult. It celebrates death. They use language like, our resistance is glorified by the blood of our martyrs, by the blood of our women and our children. It's incomprehensible. There is a huge divide in our values that makes it very difficult for us to have any kind of meaningful dialogue, as Peel indicated. Israel's military response has largely been something called the Dahia Doctrine. Dahia is, of course, a suburb of Beirut where Hezbollah is especially active. And the Dahia Doctrine, which was developed in the 1980s, is this notion that the notion that the Middle East only speaks the language of power, the language of force. And if Israel is attacked, we will strike back 10 times harder. Anyone who slaps us will knock them unconscious. And that is basically what we have seen play out in Gaza as well, with the absolutely incomprehensible degree of destruction that is estimated between 70 and 90% of the residential structures are completely flattened. And just imagine how it's going to be possible for people to reconstitute themselves in that environment. But it remains to be seen whether or not this is a successful strategy. Let me wrap up by just taking us outside of the region. We're, of course, familiar with this axis of resistance, which points to the nefarious activity of Iran in funding all of these movements. Hamas, of course, is funded heavily by Iran. Even though Hamas is Sunni and Iran is Shia, they are united in their hatred of Israel. But also Hezbollah, Islamic Revolutionary Guard in Syria and Iraq, and even the somewhat bizarre Houthis in Yemen, who have this is their actual official government slogan, God is great, death to America, death to Israel, a curse on the Jews, victory to Islam. I mean, it would be comical if it wasn't true, but this is actually their government slogans. And Iran has also been deeply involved in funding the unrest on United States and European campuses as well, which of course is something that I'm more familiar with from my day job. These markers indicate places where there have been encampments on campuses preventing Jewish students from accessing services and so on. One organization in particular, Safidun, has been extremely active in this regard. It's based in British Columbia, funneling a lot of Iranian money. It has recently lost its tax-exempt status here in the United States and in Canada, and I think that's for the better. It's amazing how since Hezbollah was knocked out, that a lot of this funding seems to have dried up, and as well the protests have dried up. But I want to tell you a little bit about the youth, and this is one perhaps light in the tunnel that will get us to the end of this lecture. This is a very, very useful poll called the Harvard-Harris poll. It's a poll of American politics. They ask these questions every month. It's very reliable, statistically significant, and so on. And since it was coming into an election year, in November of 2023, they asked a question which they have asked every month since then that had to do with foreign policy. Very simple question. In this conflict, do you side more with Israel or Hamas? Americans have hovered over the last year around 80%. This happened to be a fairly high number. The lowest number is 79%. That means that 4 out of 10 Americans support Israel, which is a good number. It bothers me that 4 out of 5 of Americans support Israel. 1 out of 5 do not. That seems like a lot to me, but nevertheless, it's a solid number and it has been stable. However, if you were to break it down by age, you see that the youngest Americans, 18 to 24, only 52% support Israel over Hamas. Meaning people who are at that age group, getting their news from social media, TikTok, and so on, were actually half and half on whether or not Israel or Hamas was correct in this conflict. Absolutely terrifying kind of number. It made me very nervous about what is the future of this country. But here's the positive aspect. The poll this month, January, indicates that support for Israel among young Americans is now up 79. It's up to 79%. And it has surged ahead of older Americans, which has actually softened a little bit. That means that suddenly, I don't know why, but suddenly young Americans got a lot smarter. I mean, a 30% rise is hard to believe. I don't know what affected it. It could have been the election somehow, but in January, they ended up becoming dramatically more supportive of Israel. And that's, I think, hopeful sign, and God willing, it will continue. Okay, so let me conclude now with the lessons of history, as best as I can understand it, and we'll wrap up with this version of Resurgence. So this is actually an interesting document. This is a text from an 1859 Siddur, Haggadah, that was published in the Russian Empire. Books were heavily censored at that time, and the censor said, how can you say this thing here, that V'hisham de Labosenu, Ela shebachol dor v'dor omdim aleinu l'chal l'seinu. How can you say that every generation there are people who hate the Jews and want to destroy us? Don't you realize we live in the paradise of the Russian Tsar? Jews are no longer persecuted here in 1859. So the censor forced the Jews to reprint their Haggadah and add the past tense, hayu omdim aleinu. It used to happen, no longer. We're totally safe in Russia now. And instead of matzilenu, we have found God saves us now. That's no longer necessary. Hitzilanu. He used to save us, but we're great. Thank you, God. Thank you, Russian Tsar. We're fine. And obviously this is amusing. But as Daniel Gordis noted in a very, very pressing sentence, he said that Zionism believed that it could change Jewish history, while American Judaism thought it could escape Jewish history, and they were both wrong. Zionism thought that by establishing a state for Jews, we would finally be normalized, we would finally be able to exist in peace with other nations side by side. It's not happened. And American Jews thought that, hey, this is America, this is democracy, this is 4th of July and everything. Obviously, in this country, Jewish history is no longer relevant. We don't have that kind of anti-Semitism. And once again, we found it right here on our back door. So let me speak to one thing which will, I believe, allow us to reflect on the resurgent aspect of it. One of the small curses of being a historian is that dates stick in my head. I use it sometimes for like passwords and things like that. I remember, oh, yeah, when did Constantinople fall? Right, that'll be in my passport. Right? So sometimes things like that happen. And the date October 7th stuck in my mind because I remembered there was another revolt on October 7th, this time in 1944. And it was a revolt of the most wretched sufferers of the Holocaust you can imagine. Specifically, Zalman Gradowski is shown here with his wife in 1935. Zalman Gradowski was one of the Sonderkommando, meaning he was incarcerated in one of the death camps, and he was forced to work removing the corpses of the Jews, sometimes from his own communities, people he actually knew, from the gas chambers and transport them to the crematoria. He did this day in and day out. He was a religious Jew. Every night he would go back to the barracks and he would say Kaddish for the Jews that he burned every day in, day out. Whenever he found a scrap of paper, he would write down what he had seen, what he had saw, and he actually buried these scraps of paper in the literal ashes of the Jews, writing that he knows that one day archaeologists will come and will dig up the remains of the Jews, and they will find his writings, and they will learn what happened in that terrible place. And B'Kachava, that's exactly what happened. After the war, his writings were discovered in Auschwitz. They were unearthed. They were eventually published. The most chilling diary you can imagine. And he describes, these are some of the pages here in his Yiddish prose. He describes a remarkable event that at one point, the Nazis actually convened a gathering of dignitaries to watch the gassing of a group of young Jewish women from Czechoslovakia. And they brought these Jewish women in, they stripped them naked in front of these Nazis, obscenely gazing at them, and then they were going to process them into the gas chamber while the Nazis would watch how the whole thing unfolded. Gradowski was there as one of the Sonderkommando, and he writes as follows. In the large bunker stand thousands of victims waiting for death. All at once, spontaneously, a song rings out. The clique of superior officers stand transfixed. They cannot understand. They cannot grasp. How is it possible that they're in that bunker, in the heart of the grave, on the threshold of extinction, in the last moments of life, that people, instead of moaning, instead of weeping over their young lives about to be snuffed out, can raise their voices in song. The melody of the song does not let them rest. It troubles them, shatters the certainty they felt up to now. A new song of faith and courage comes pouring out of their hearts. The mass now sings the national anthem. They sing the Hatikva. Imagine these courageous young Czechoslovak women singing the Hatikva, knowing they're about to go to their deaths. It made a tremendous impact on Gradowski. Shortly thereafter, he organized a rebellion against the Nazis. They actually succeeded in blowing up one of the crematoria, and he was killed in the unsuccessful revolt. But I think this speaks to something very important about the notion of resurgence. We began our discussion with this coin, the Judea Capta. It kind of, describes the whole idea of diaspora, of exile, of the Jews being completely and utterly defeated by circumstances. In 1959, on the 10th anniversary of the State of Israel, the government commissioned a coin to commemorate Judea Capta. And the coin was designed as follows. On one side, they had a reproduction of this iconic image with the oversized Roman soldier and the despondent woman and so on. And underneath it says, Galsa Yehuda, the Jews are exiled. But on the obverse, which would have had the Asian portrait, they chose to provide this image, which oddly echoes the graphic representation. But instead of the Roman soldier, you have a young Jewish woman playing with her infant child. And instead of the despondent Jewish woman, you have a kibbutznik planting a tree, hope for the future. And this is fundamentally the message that we need to absorb, in my humble opinion. And that in terms of resurgence, we must realize that we are fundamentally, and unlike our enemies, a life-affirming people. We are a people that looks to the future. We derive our identities from the past, but we are fundamentally committed to our future. We believe in the sanctity of life. It sounds like a platitude, but it's not. It's exactly what is at the core of our being. And our commitment to that notion of the sanctity of life is what is going to get us through this current crisis. And with that, I want to thank you very much for your endurance and your attention. Thank you.